The screen now shows Lackertz and me, and while Mark was well suited for Watergate, since he was, well, he could talk about what he was doing, I had absolutely no reason to land a job at the Watergate Committee, except that we decided that I would leave San Francisco and come and live with Mark. Luckily, I did have in my background working with lots of documents and antitrust cases for a great big law firm, and I'm in San Francisco, and so I was able to deal with and be part of all the documents and all the things we collected and get them into a computerized system that we'll talk about later. So I did bring some skills, but no political knowledge.
But you did bring yourself to Washington.
Yes, I did.
More important. I was finishing up my last year of law school, and I had taken a job tentatively with a public interest law firm in Washington that was run by a fellow named Terry Lenzner. And I flew out to San Francisco to try and convince Mary to move to Washington.
I did not want to move to Washington. I like San Francisco.
But I couldn't find interesting work that I wanted to do in San Francisco. So I got a call out there in end of March from one of my roommates who said, well, you better call this fellow Lenzner because he's lost his tax. I was just in Washington. He lost his tax exemption, and I don't think you have a job. So I called Terry.
Why did he lose the tax exemption, Mark? Who took it away?
The Nixon administration.
Specifically, John Mitchell.
Well, in any case, so Terry said, oh, listen, don't worry about it. This is in March of my third year of law school. I only have 2 months to go to get my degree, and this is the job I've taken. He said, don't worry. Yes, we're out of business. You don't have a job at this point, but don't worry, because something's going to work out. And my dad always told me that it's much better to be lucky than to be smart. So I told Mary, Terry told me that something was going to work out. And Mary said, wait a minute, you've got these offers in San Francisco. I'm here. It's a beautiful apartment. What is wrong with you?
That is true. That is actually true.
And I said,
that's what true love is. For my point, not yours.
So I said, well, let's see what happens. I'll keep the offers in San Francisco open, but let's see what happens. And literally 2 weeks later, Terry called me in law school and said, how quickly can I come down to Washington to start to work? And I said, well, let me talk to my professors, tell them I'm going to miss the last couple weeks of class, assure them that I'll finish up my assignments, and I'll be down there. So I did that. To show you the perspective of everybody, one of my law professors told me it was his words, a tragedy that I was going to miss the last couple weeks of his class. And
we all share the tears.
I said, yeah, I share your pain, no question about it.
That was then,
yeah.
But a long time ago.
And now this is after we started with the committee, what we looked like 50 years ago. Just to give you a little perspective, on the right there label is Chairman Urban, Senator Urban. He came down to our quarters at the committee occasionally, not often. Next to him is Terry Lenzner, who is my boss and Mary's boss at the committee, and who was sort of the straw that stirred the drink at the committee in terms of the investigation and pushing things and lining up witnesses, interviewing, doing the investigation. There I am next to Carmen. You can't see Carmen Bolinos.
There's no name on Carmen, but he was a fabulous investigator and a friend of the Kennedys, and he liked me a lot. He got me into a lot of mischief on his.
A lot of trouble.
Yeah, a lot of trouble.
You were very cute in those days.
I was adorable. I was a babe.
You were cute as hell, no question about it.
And Lackertz looked like Art Garfunkel.
He does.
I know, and that's after a haircut. You should have.
He still does. Yeah, so we thought, so to summarize what we want to do over the next 4 weeks, we thought today we'd talk about the political background in the late 60s, early 70s. Next session, we talk about the break-in itself, the beginning of the cover-up, the prosecution, the formation of the committee. At this point, everything was still being driven by journalists, by the newspapers, mostly by Woodward and Bernstein. and by the prosecutors, Earl Silbert and his team, that we'll get to in the next section. And section 3, we'll talk about how we organized the investigation, how we prepared for the hearings, the witness list, and the political back and forth. One of the things that I want to spend a little bit of time on is that we had a reputation for being bipartisan, and it was bipartisan to the public, but behind the public was a lot of argument, debate, discussion.
And intrigue.
And intrigue, yes. Because we had to work, we on the Democratic side had to work with the Republicans had to work with us. The Republicans also had an open book to the administration. So, for example, at the first meeting of the committee, at the executive session, Sam Dash, our chief counsel, called my colleague, Scott Armstrong, and said, please follow Senator Baker's administrative assistant after we break up this meeting. So Scott dropped everything, did that, went out and followed Senator Baker's administrative assistant. And where did he go? He went directly to the executive office building, went inside. Scott didn't follow him inside, but instead called the White House counsel's office and asked for him by name. And he came on the phone and said yes. And Scott said, well, I guess I found you where I thought I would, at the president's, at the administration. And he said, damn it, Armstrong, and hung up the phone. And Senator Ervin then confronted Senator Baker with the fact that his administrative assistant was taking everything from our committee and sending it to the White House. And Baker, to his credit, fired his administrative assistant. Now, obviously, the administrative assistant didn't do it on his own, but it happened. And then in section 4, the main contribution of our committee, I thought, was John Dean's testimony and the discovery of the White House tapes. And that really changed the shape of the investigation and the level of seriousness a fair amount. And so we'll spend a fair amount of time on John Dean's testimony in section 3. And in section 4, we'll talk about how we were fortunate enough to discover the White House tapes and the consequences and what happened after that. So let me just pause for a second. We don't need section 5 because we're not going to have it. But I think one of the things we were hoping to do was to compare and contrast then and now. And just as the great Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, the same man does not step in the same river twice, because the man changes and the river changes. Similarly with scandals, the same scandal does not step in the same environment twice, because the scandal changes and the environment changes. So we want to keep a bit of a focus on what's changed, what's stayed the same, what's different, what's identical. And not much is identical anymore, as we all know from just reading the newspapers and watching the news and talking about things, particularly with the media. In any case, let's move on to the political environment of 1968. We have a brief video here.
You want to say anything before I start, or just?
No, that's good. Launch.
1968 was a year filled with twists and turns, including a dramatic turn of fortune 50 years ago this month, with the election of a politician who'd all but written himself off years before. Richard Schlesinger looks back.
You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
It was hard to imagine in 1962 that Richard Nixon would be worth kicking around anymore. He'd lost one presidential election, and he just lost a second election to be governor of California.
Thank you, gentlemen, and good day.
Even Pat Buchanan, who would become one of Nixon's speechwriters, knew rehabilitating him would be tough.
He was a loser. He had lost and lost and lost. The only way you get rid of this loser image is to win.
But by 1968, the stage was being set for a law and order candidate like Richard Nixon.
The country was pre-revolutionary in 1968.
Historian Evan Thomas is the author of Being Nixon.
There were race riots, riots on campuses. The country was divided in a way that it had not been since the Civil War, worse than it is today.
Nixon's main Republican rivals, George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller, dropped out.
Nixon was lucky in that the Republican Party was falling apart around him. And Nixon, the old pro, was there to fill the vacuum.
So was Nixon lucky or good?
All great politicians are lucky and good, and Nixon was both.
Lucky for Nixon, the Democrats were being divided on the left by the Vietnam War and on the right by George Wallace, who was siphoning off voters attracted by his race-based populism.
These are the kind of folks that people are sick and tired of in this country all over the United States.
Nixon was ready to get kicked around again, but he still had a lot of kick left in him.
Those who have lost elections in the past have come back to win. I hope to come back to win.
The plan was to run against Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent president. But just 2 months after Nixon got into the race,
I shall not seek,
luckily for him,
and I will not accept
everything changed.
the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Patrick Buchanan told Nixon that Johnson had dropped out.
Did he seem surprised?
Oh, he was stunned. We were stunned.
Nixon accepted the Republican nomination in August of '68, just a few weeks before his biggest break yet.
Burning my credentials. The Democratic Party can't be democratic. I mean, what hope is there for democracy?
Democrats had their calamitous convention in Chicago, while the cops were outside clubbing demonstrators on the head. Delegates were inside, shooting themselves in the foot.
Enforce order in the convention.
Nixon loved every minute of the Democratic convention. Don't elect those crazy Democrats. You're going to have riots in the streets. Elect me and I'll bring some order and quiet.
Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination, but his old friend, then Senator Walter Mondale, remembers it didn't mean much.
He finally had his chance, and the nomination was worthless.
Worthless.
Well, it proved to be worth something, but at that time it looked like it was poisoned.
By contrast, Nixon's campaign ran with military-grade discipline. He traveled with an entourage of managers and message men, overseen by John Mitchell.
We do operate, I believe, in an orderly fashion, and that comes from preparation. We have planned it and programmed it and have had the time to carry it out.
It was all working. Nixon was up, way up in the polls, until September 30th, when Hubert Humphrey turned the tide with this speech.
I want to talk with you about Vietnam.
Humphrey repudiated Lyndon Johnson's war policy.
As president, I would stop the bombing of the North as an acceptable risk for peace.
The announcement would narrow the polls dramatically. Nixon immediately had an unexpected order for his personal aide, Dwight Chapin.
Get President Johnson on the phone.
Who did he say that to?
He said it to me. I had no idea what to do, so I asked Rose Woods, who was Nixon's secretary. She said, call 456-1414 in Washington.
That's the White House number.
That's the White House number, and asked to speak to the president.
Mr. President? Yes. I'm awfully sorry to bother you. This is Dick Nixon.
Yes, Dick.
President Johnson was recording the call as Nixon discussed Humphrey's speech.
This will be interpreted, as I'm sure you know, as a dramatic move away from the administration. It's my intention not to move in that direction.
Did you have a sense of how strange that call was?
I felt that it was one of the most intriguing political maneuvers that I had ever heard. For Richard Nixon to be calling Lyndon Johnson, and he's telling the president, I'm with you, not exactly those words, but implying it.
Mondale thinks it's evidence that Johnson might have been rooting against his own party's nominee, his own vice president.
Do you think Johnson wanted Humphrey to win?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I think at the end, the last 2 weeks, he wanted him to win. But I think the early part of the campaign, he was mad at Humphrey. He thought Humphrey wasn't being loyal enough.
Do you think Johnson wanted Nixon to win?
I thought so for a while because he was doing things to help Nixon.
But Johnson ended up helping Humphrey come within a hair of winning with this speech 5 days before the election.
I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease.
I thought we had lost. Humphrey had momentum.
I thought we could make it.
Those must have been very heady days.
Yes, finally going to get a Minnesota president.
They almost did, but Nixon held on to win by just about 500,000 votes.
Richard Nixon goes over the top.
Richard Nixon had known bitter defeat in elections even closer than this, and he was magnanimous in victory. Nixon had Dwight Chapin set up a meeting with Humphrey just days after the election. And as the meeting ended, Chapin saw a side of Nixon
Have a visit with Vice President Humphrey.
few others ever saw.
The men had their arms around one another. Humphrey was sobbing. Nixon was patting him on the back saying, Hubert, you know, everything is going to be okay. You and Muriel are going to have a great life. Humphrey chokes out, if there's anything that I can ever do, I want to be doing it for you. It was such a poignant moment.
There's the president waving goodbye.
Dwight Chapin, 27, graduate of the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency.
Where is the administration plan to make America first again in manufacturing?
Thank you. Obviously,
They laughed at me when I used.
Just to go back over the events in I don't know, does anybody long for returning to 1968?
No, it was a terrible, horrible time. Yeah.
I agree. I graduated from college in June of 1968, and it's one of the worst years I can ever remember. But to give you some idea, just to reinforce the points from the video, in January of 68, President Johnson eliminated graduate deferments. So everybody graduating in 68 had to enlist somehow or another or be drafted. And so as a result, the demonstrations against the war ramped up significantly in the first half of 1968. And the country became more bitterly divided. Secondly, after the New Hampshire primary, Senator Gene McCarthy received over 40% of the vote against Lyndon Johnson. And as a result, the next week, President Johnson dropped out of the election, as we saw in the Jane Pauley video. Then, all of a sudden, in late March, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, which brought forth a number of urban riots and demonstrations. And you can see a picture here of Washington being torched after the assassination and the demonstrations. There was a huge amount of anger. And as a result, some of the political environment turned to focusing on law and order as opposed to domestic political issues or housing or health care or any of the things that usually drive elections. So we had, and then after all this happened in June, after the California primary that Bobby Kennedy won, he was assassinated. And I remember that because it was 3 days before my college graduation, and my graduation was postponed. And I can remember going down to a hill outside of my college to watch the train carrying Bobby Kennedy's funeral cortege pass by. Then after that, we had the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July of 1968. And then finally, a couple years later, we had Kent State, where the National Guard opened fire on protesting students on that knoll and killed a couple students. So it was obviously a bad time. On the other hand, I think it's important to remember that the Nixon administration had a number of accomplishments that we shouldn't lose track of. and I don't want to make this sort of any more political than it already is, but let's just remember a number of the environmentalists were all working hard toward creating the Environmental Protection Agency. That was done under the Nixon administration. It was bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats had parts of their party that were vigorous pro-environmentalists. Nixon also had some significant foreign policy accomplishments, including opening up China and reaching détente with the Soviet Union to sort of reduce the level of threat, and signing an anti-ballistic missile treaty. The amendments to the Clean Air Act and the Clean Air Act itself were passed by the Nixon administration. And perhaps the most significant thing, I didn't put it on the slide, but I should have, is that Nixon also signed Title IX of the Higher Education Act that mandated equal treatment for women's sports and male sports, and really gave a boost to women's athletics. And what we see today in terms of the professional leagues of basketball and soccer and gymnastics, etc. That all came about because of Title IX of the Higher Education Act that Nixon signed. And finally, just to note that President Nixon also signed the Plaza Agreement, which was to end the fixed rates of foreign currencies on the gold standard, which created part of our free trade environment that's being dismantled as we speak. But that was done under President Nixon. So let me pause there before we go on to why was he so paranoid. Let's go back and let's pause. Does anybody have a comment or question about what we just talked about? Yeah, Mary.
I'm just going to say, I was young, but I was at the 68 convention in Chicago.
Were you?
Yes, I was staying with a relative. I wasn't crazy, but I was there and daily and everything. I was part of it. So.
Right. And Lance, you were in Chicago in 68, weren't you?
I was in Chicago in 68, but I'm not guilty, Mark.
Well, the statute of limitations has run already, so I think you're free.
Well, that's a great relief.
What was your perspective from engaging in the protests outside the convention?
Yeah, I was in Chicago as part of Maryland Citizens for McCarthy. And we brought suits and ties with us to Chicago, which we drove across I remember driving across Indiana, I think half asleep. And what happened there was simply what was later characterized as a police riot by the commission that looked into that. But we thought that Richard Nixon was the worst man and the worst president that one could ever envision, and that we thought if we could, we were hoping that Eugene McCarthy would be the next president of the United States. And a lot of things happened from that because, of course, Robert Kennedy had gotten into the race. He was assassinated. And there was a push in Chicago for Ted Kennedy to become the nominee. And there were several delegates in the Maryland delegation that were looking to make Ted Kennedy the nominee, including, interestingly, George McGovern, who was thought to be the stalking horse for Ted Kennedy at that particular convention. And I hated at that point in time our Senator Daniel Brewster, who was very much pushing for McGovern to be the nominee, again, a stalking horse for Ted Kennedy. And at that point in time, I decided I was going to support the next Republican candidate for Senate, was Senator Charles Mathias in Maryland. But it was a moving and a life-altering moment to be in Chicago in 1968. And, to have... it wasn't Peter, Paul, and Mary. I think it was Peter and Mary singing The Great Mandela as the Chicago police were moving in, clubbing randomly anyone they could see. It was quite the moment.
Thanks, Lance. Other people have Any participation in 1968 in the politics or in demonstrations?
I do. I was a freshman at UCLA. And everybody that was not below average in their grades was so afraid they were going to flunk out and get drafted. And people were talking about moving to Canada a lot. And I said, oh, I'll go with you. And my boyfriend at the time, who was very skinny, he flunked out and he decided to lose a lot of weight and so he would have his 4F. And he did. That's my story.
Did he
Yeah, Bob?
In 1968, I was a draft dodger.
You?
You were a draft dodger in 68?
I didn't register with the
Select service.
Select service.
Yeah.
Yeah, I refused to do that.
You didn't register?
I've never registered. Because I took my oath of office.
Because you got a commission at the academy?
Yes. Oh, thank goodness you had a cover story.
Yeah, Maggie.
I was working for Mass Financial Services in Boston, a very stodgy investment firm. And we went, a group of us went and protested. And I remember the head of the company was so appalled that we had done that. But we did, and I felt very proud because it was so important. The Vietnam War was so terrible. And fortunately, I didn't get fired, but I was a little careful after that.
And the war didn't end for a while either. Right. Yeah, Joyce.
I think that scene of what was taking place and broadcast on TV started at least a 40-year bad relationship between my father and my husband, because we were dating at the time, and he was very worried that he was going to, potentially be drafted. He was supposed to start graduate school in the fall. And my father had served in World War II as a bombardier navigator, stayed in Judge Advocate's Corps, very much committed to the military. And here's this young kid coming in with the longer hair. And my father's like telling the cops, hit him. And Ben was so horrified. So it was it was a moment that I used to see in my mind.
Right.
Ben coming to pick me up, and they were like, oh my God. But I also want to put a footnote on, my graduate work at Stanford was paid by Richard Nixon and EPA fellowships, so I'm very grateful.
I want to circle back to part of the video. I think I've read just about anything that Teddy White read about making him president. I don't remember mention about the phone call from Nixon to Johnson.
Yeah.
I don't think we knew about
that. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Well, you understand why he was known as Tricky Dick. I mean, that's the kind of maneuver that most politicians don't. I shouldn't say most, but it's
Johnson accepted the call.
Outside of that.
Oh, yes, he does. Yes,
Johnson accepted the call.
Johnson accepted the call.
True.
I was going to say on my end of it, my mom and dad were Republicans. My dad also served in the Second World War. He was a doctor in the South Pacific, ran a big hospital. And I can remember that Halloween, where Dad carved in the pumpkin's mouth Nixon and Ike. So this was in our household very upsetting. I was at Northwestern in 68 as a junior. But you could see and had three brothers. Two was in Cambodia, one was in Cambodia as a surgeon, and the other was just finishing medical school. He was going to go too. And the third one had his own deferment. But the fact is that in our own household, things were being pulled apart. And this had nothing to do with Watergate yet. That would just later put the cherry on the sundae.
Well, do you think we were more polarized then or less polarized than we are today?
I think we were less polarized.
Yeah.
I think I know we were polarized. I was, all through the Vietnam War, I was a student, I protested. I didn't hear the hate that I hear today. And I agree.
The interesting thing is, if you look at the things that Nixon did accomplish.
Yes, very
That are very
complicated.
bipartisan.
Right. Right.
Opening of China was a very big deal.
Yeah.
And only a Republican could do it, probably. But Doug, why do you think it was we had the capacity to be bipartisan then, and now we seem stalled? Do you have a?
I don't have an answer.
Okay.
Well,
If Nixon had not opened up relations with China, we couldn't have put 145% tariff on them today.
Mary, I do have one answer, and I think back then, we had 3 news channels that we all watched. We all read basically the same newspapers, so we were all fed the same information.
Right.
Now, what we feed, because when I talk to people who have a different view, I look at where do they get their information.
Right, I think that's really
And
important.
that's, and I look at where I get my information, so.
Do you hear that?
I agree. Well,
Part of this too, to say, were we more polarized then or now? I think it's kind of like saying, who was a better athlete, Mickey Mantle or Wayne Gretzky? You know, it depends on where you are at the time.
Yeah.
I look back at, where some of us were in the military back then, and it was a very different country. Lynn's leading a book discussion with just before right now about a Vietnam nurse. And
We came back to a horrible situation where everyone had been told there were no women in Vietnam. So when she needed help, even going to the VA, they wouldn't give her help. Because no women weren't there.
Yeah, there was a shocking story.
Yeah.
It's a shocking story, and
Yes.
it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, the woman, she made it, it's historical fiction.
Yeah.
It's a very, very powerful book.
Yeah.
I just read it.
Did you?
Yeah, it was great.
I should join our discussion. So,
Yeah, we should, yeah.
Okay, well, given the accomplishments of the Nixon administration the first couple of years, even though he didn't end the Vietnam War, I guess the question arises, why was he so very paranoid? And the paranoia went all through the White House, as we discovered in the Watergate investigation. And there are a number of explanations. I've put a few of them up here, and I'd like to be able to discuss them because I think that's at the root cause of some of these problems. He had a very difficult childhood. He came from a poor family. His father had trouble holding a job. His mother was quite devoted to Nixon and his brothers. He had 2 brothers, 3 actually. One died very young. He had a deep and abiding anger to the elites, particularly the Eastern elites, and especially the Kennedys. Nixon was very convinced that the 1960 election was stolen from him by the Kennedys, working with Richard Daley in Chicago to steal the 40,000 votes that put the state over the top for Kennedy. And so he was convinced that the Kennedys were always doing to him what he was trying to do to them. And it's one of those states of paranoia where you just project that the other person is thinking exactly the same about you that you're thinking about them. It's kind of a dangerous mentality, I think. Third, we have the demonstrations which were ramping up during his administration. They were getting worse, not less. The anti-war movement was getting stronger, and they hated the demonstrations. This is a man who got elected on a platform of law and order. So to the extent that the order was disrupted by anybody, that was a problem. And he didn't like that. He was totally suspicious of the press and convinced the press was out to get him, as you can see from that clip in California from 1962. And he was right. I mean, there was no question about the fact the press was anti-Nixon for all sorts of reasons. Primarily, I think, because it had a liberal tilt. And so he was right, but it made him incredibly suspicious. So let's pause there. What are people's views of Nixon's paranoia? Why do you think he was so paranoid? Bob?
Kind of goes back to what you said, and Teddy White wrote about this too. If you look at Haldeman, for example, he graduated from USC. He brought in a lot of his fraternity brothers from USC, and they were kind of the pranksters. They really weren't very serious. And he felt inferior to folks went to Yale, and Harvard, and that sort of thing. So I think that really influenced the way he looked at how he served as vice president and as president of the United States.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. I mean, there was a certain mentality, almost a fraternity mentality, among all those people from USC or from UCLA or California folks versus the Eastern. You know, it's like the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party. They didn't trust that at all.
I just want to say one thing. Growing up in LA, in terms of USC versus UCLA, the people that didn't get into UCLA who could afford to go to USC did. And, you know, it was called the University for Spoiled Children. Yeah, that's my 2 bets.
I think that's right, Mark, that it was a big part of his character. He just was a paranoid man.
Well, I think I read something at one point that said he was an introvert in an extroverted profession. And it's very hard to be an introvert as a politician because you're not opening yourself to others, you're actually closing yourself and hiding yourself. And I think that creates a dynamic that's very self-destructive. Anyway, so then let's fast forward to the Pentagon Papers, because this is an important turning point. In June of '71, Nixon's fears and Kissinger's fears came to pass because the Pentagon Papers were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg and published by the New York Times and the Washington Post, contrary to the directions of the foreign policy and national security establishment, but approved by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court let them publish. As a result, the plumbers were set up in June of '71, and these involved the same exact people who would later break into the Watergate building. Setting up the plumbers was tasked to Chuck Colson in the White House. He contacted his old classmate from Brown, a fellow named Howard Hunt. And Howard Hunt collected the group that became the plumbers, and they broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist office in June of '71. This incident, this case was important to me personally because it was the way I ended up getting to Terry Lenzner. Terry Lenzner was asked to participate in Ellsberg's defense. He flew out to California to meet with Ellsberg, thought he was crazy, and said, I'm not going to be part of this. He said that to his buddy, his very good friend, Charlie Nesson, who was my law school professor in my last year of law school. And Charlie was part of the defense team for Ellsberg. So in the fall of '71, Charlie drafted me to work on some research and motions in the Ellsberg case. So I wrote some motions and did some research for Charlie. He liked it. And when Terry called him to ask, did he have any students that he would recommend, I found myself at the top of Charlie's list being recommended to Terry. And so that's how I met Terry, was because of the Ellsberg
And
case.
I just want to talk to the strength of the old boys network. Because it's not because you're more valued or anything, it's because you know who you know and you know it. Hello, Washington. So the background is, of course, later on in '72, I'm going to meet Mark, but it's on this fragile relationship of a professor who, oh, by the way, and who do you know, and call this guy, and that's how Lackwitz gets to Lenzner. Again, I'm in San Francisco, and the job he initially offers doesn't happen, and he still hangs on to the old boy network, believing that something will happen. The word Watergate, assistant counsel, they've never come up.
Did it work out?
Yeah, true love. But the fact is, it was on this old boy connection that Lackertz then called. He said, come on down, I got a job for you. He doesn't even know what it entails. And I'm worried because we always hear anxiety with MacArthur hearings. And I told you, my family's a very Republican family. And I thought, holy Toledo, what are we doing? Who's in charge? Okay, that's my 2 cents.
I have a question. So why is it that Daniel Ellsberg is leaking top secret stuff and he didn't go to prison?
He does go to prison.
He does? Okay.
No, he was he was acquitted because and the government dropped the case because of behavior, the break-in into a psychiatrist's office, which was going to cause them to have to exclude lots of material that they had. So the government ended up dropping the case because of prosecutorial misconduct, basically.
And also, is everyone familiar with the Pentagon Papers and why that was so dynamic and dynamite?
Well, yeah, because nobody in the public knew that was going on before that.
Right. And our involvement went back so far to Eisenhower, in essence, not just.
Yeah, but it's people being lied to.
Yes, people have been being lied to by journalism, by the media, and by politicians and everybody else.
You know, I think people were so surprised that, look at this, he hid this information that was contrary to what the government, wait a minute. How many times have we seen that since it just last week they popped up about the pier for going into Gaza? It's like they had all that information, they just hide it. That is a typical thing the government always does. If it's embarrassing to the government, they hide it. In that case, they hid the Pentagon Papers and the recent case, the $230 million pier for 20 days. So that's typical, but.
The quintessential comment on that was made by Senator Fulbright during a Foreign Relations Committee when he kept getting the response that, well, Senator, that's classified. And Fulbright in a Southern drawl said, well, just because it's classified, don't make it true. And that proved to be the case quite frequently in that.
The beauty of a democracy, it's not smooth.
I think it's been 5 decades, so I don't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday.
Yeah.
But I think what I recall from that was that it exposed that we were not trying to win the war. It was all about the money. You go back to Bob McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense, it was all about the money. And what they taught us at the Naval Academy was, if you go to war, you go all in. Just don't nibble around the edges.
Right.
I think that was what I recall. That was the problem, is that the government was involved in this war, and they really weren't trying to get it done and over with.
Well, it was like going into a boxing match with one arm tied behind your back.
Right.
And assuming that, with one arm you could defeat an enemy that was fighting with 2 of them, at least at a minimum.
Come on.
No, yeah. Anyway, so let's see here. Let's go on to the video. Yes.
Tomorrow marks the 40th anniversary of the end of Richard Nixon's presidency, an occasion to look back at a man and a moment that changed the country.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
On the evening of August 8, 1974, from the Oval Office, President Richard Nixon announced his resignation. This after a 2-year-long saga that became known as the Watergate scandal. On June 17, 1972, 5 men who had been hired by the committee to re-elect the president were arrested, trying to bug the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex. It was one part of a large clandestine effort to ensure Nixon's re-election. That fall, he won by a landslide, beating Senator George McGovern by nearly 18 million votes. But investigations into the Watergate break-in continued, eventually tying the White House to the burglary. In February 1973, a Senate committee began to look into the president's connection to the Watergate break-in and the subsequent cover-up. That May, the special panel began hearings, which lasted 9 months. Some members of President Nixon's own administration testified against him, including former White House counsel John Dean, who said there had been a cover-up, one he had discussed with the president.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
And former White House aide Alexander Butterfield confirmed the existence of audio tapes on which the president had recorded all telephone calls and conversations in the Oval Office since 1971.
Are you aware of any devices that were installed in the executive office building office of the president?
Yes, sir.
After the hearings, Democrats, commentators, and even members of his own party called for the president to resign. But he resisted with comments like this at a news conference in March of '74.
It perhaps would be an act of courage to resign. It also takes courage to stand and fight for what you believe is right, and that's what I intend to do.
The president also refused to turn over the Oval Office tapes until, on July 24th, the Supreme Court ordered their release. 3 days later, the House Judiciary Committee voted along bipartisan lines to approve articles of impeachment, charging the president with obstruction of justice and abuse of power. He continued to proclaim his innocence until a group of Republican congressional leaders told him he could not survive votes in either house, at which time he finally decided to step down.
Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed.
The next day, Richard Nixon departed the White House, becoming the only American president to resign the office. And we take this moment to look back at someone who had a profound effect on our nation. And joining us for that is Beverly Gage. She's professor of 20th century American history at Yale University. Presidential historian Timothy Naftali, former director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. He's now head of the Tamanat Library and Robert F. Wagner Archives at New York University. Pat Buchanan, who served as a senior advisor in the Nixon White House, and he's author of the book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. And Luke Nichter, co-author with Douglas Brinkley of the book, The Nixon Tapes, a compilation of key conversations recorded by the president's secret White House taping system. And we welcome you all to the NewsHour. Pat Buchanan, as someone who knew Richard Nixon very well, why do you think it's important that we look back at him and look back at his presidency?
Well, I think certainly when you mention the Watergate scandal, it was the greatest scandal in American political history. It brought down his presidency. Bill Clinton was impeached, but he survived that. But Nixon's presidency, I think, is an extraordinary thing because if you take a look at his first term and not the Watergate second term, I think you would find him one of the most consequential of all presidents. He had opened up China. He had negotiated arms control with the Soviet Union. He had ended the draft. He had desegregated the South. He had enacted the 18-year-old vote, and, built EPA and OSHA and the Cancer Institute. So he was an enormously consequential president, and it's my view and some others' view that had he sort of stood down, say, before it rated his second term, I think he would have been a near great president. But there's no question that the second term was a failure. And what people remember are two things, Nixon to China and Watergate.
Luke Nichter, Pat Buchanan raises the fact that there are many aspects to this man. It wasn't just Watergate. You told us this week, you said we're still trying to digest this man 40 years later. Why is that?
Pat sounds like a spokesperson for the book in some ways. I think I didn't know this 10 years ago when I started working on the tapes, but I know it now that when you add up all of the Watergate and abuses of government power, we now call it, material on the tapes, it's only about 5 to 7% of the total tapes. Yet these 5 to 7% have created almost 100% of our impression of the man and his presidency.
But when you look at this, there's still a fascination with Richard Nixon. Why is that?
We still have 700 to 800 hours of tapes that have not been released. And so we're already drowning in tapes, and yet we still have a lot more to learn. I teach 18 to 20-year-olds who, for them, Richard Nixon is as ancient as the American Civil War. They don't even have a great living memory of 9/11. They want to learn something other than Watergate.
Beverly Gage, you talked to us about how he really was part of a series of things that happened to this country in the late 60s and 70s. Expand on that. What do you mean?
Right. Well, I think we have to see Watergate really in the context of a whole series of crises in the American government. And in many ways, Watergate is the most dramatic of them. But it comes in the context of a huge struggle over Vietnam, over secrecy over Vietnam, over the ways that the intelligence establishment had been treating anti-war protesters at home. It comes in the midst of real turmoil, certainly over civil rights in the United States, but, the breakdown in some ways of democracy at the Democratic National Convention. And so Watergate became sort of a place where all of these contests came together and were, I think, played out in Watergate, in addition to playing out people's views of Richard Nixon himself.
And so, Tim Naftali, is that one reason why we remain so fascinated by him?
Well, we remain fascinated by him because, on the one hand, he was brilliant. He was also a political icon in this country for 50 years. And at the same time, he remains the only president to resign. Those 2 years, from the moment that the break-in occurred at the Watergate until the time he resigned, Richard Nixon fought with the truth. And ultimately, the American people and all three branches of government learned that he had been lying all along. By overstepping his bounds, Richard Nixon tested our constitutional structure. What happened 40 years ago this week was that the U.S. constitutional structure showed that it could last, it was flexible enough to deal with a president who had exceeded his constitutional bounds. As Beverly intimated, this really was the high point of the imperial presidency. From this point on, Congress and the Supreme Court would be taking measures, putting them in place to reduce to some extent executive authority. Richard Nixon is Shakespearean because he was so full of power, so full of darkness, so full of ambition that he tested our constitutional structure and reshaped it in a way that I'm sure he regretted, but in a way that has been helpful to all Americans.
Shakespearean, Pat Buchanan, you worked with him. You started working with him well before he was
followed
president.
the saintly Lyndon Johnson, who was wiretapping Dr. Martin Luther King, and they're taking the products of the wiretap and delivering them to the press corps. All that was covered up. But I will say your question is excellent. Why is there such a fascination? Look, Richard Nixon was a national figure in 1947. I don't know what grade I was in. He nailed Alger Hiss. He was in the whole McCarthy-Truman era. He was at the center of that. The second youngest vice president, loses to the legendary JFK, loses in California, says goodbye and good luck, I'm out of politics, manages what I call the greatest comeback in American political history, vaults to a 49-state victory on top of the world. And because of the mendacity and because of, frankly, the indecisiveness in Watergate, not to step up and say, look, our guys did it, I didn't know about it, and we got to cut them dead. And that's what Nixon used to say. Hold it. Nixon used to say, Asquith, the prime minister, said, a prime minister's got to be a good butcher. He was not a good butcher.
Well, wait.
Tim Naftali.
Wait, if I may. Pat, you've reduced Watergate to just the break-in and the cover-up of the break-in. Mm-hmm. Watergate turned out to be a pattern of abuses of power, which are well documented by the tapes. I'll grant, Luke, it's true. It's only about 202 hours, but those are startling, dramatic, and very, very troubling 202 hours. The president applied to the domestic realm the kinds of activities that we associate with foreign covert action. He didn't mind doing whatever was necessary to hurt his political enemies. He ordered things that, fortunately, people didn't follow up on.
Well, look, now who was a deep throat? The Washington Post hero. Mark Felt, in charge of black bag jobs for J. Edgar Hoover. Here he was, a corrupt FBI agent, stealing secrets out of the grand jury, turning them over to reporters who were getting the fruits of his crimes in order to bring down a president. Now, look, this was a very tough era. There were things done in Watergate also. I was offered the headship of the plumbers. And I went over and looked at these cowboys, and I said, I don't think I want to do this job. But some stupid idiot went into Galesburg's psychiatrist's office. For what purpose, I don't know. But Nixon didn't know it.
All right, well, we're not going to resolve so much of this 40 years later, but we will keep on trying. But I'm interested, Luke Nichter, and after listening to more than 3,000 hours of those tapes, what more did you learn about this man? That we think we know everything about him, but you learned more.
And we still have plenty more to learn. I think what I've come away with, I think, a deeper appreciation for both his good traits and for his faults. I say, let's give Nixon credit where credit is due, and let's continue to criticize where we think criticism is due. I think what's clear with this discussion is that Nixon does occupy this sort of unique place in our public consciousness. We like to put presidents in boxes. We have the top third, the bottom third, we have average, we have below average. Where does Nixon fall? What box do we put him in? Who else is in the box? Can a box even contain Richard Nixon?
Yeah. Well, Beverly Gage, that's a good question for you as someone who looks at contemporary American history. What box does he fit into?
Right. Well, it's the interesting thing about Nixon, as Luke says, is that he fits into a lot of boxes. So if you're going to do your pure numerical rankings of how successful a president was, certainly the only president to resign ends up pretty close to the bottom. But there's a whole series of kind of revisionist discussions about Nixon. Was Nixon actually a liberal? Right. By today's political standards, the man who founded the EPA, should we think of him?
A Republican who founded the EPA, advanced women's equal employment, started the war on cancer. You could go on.
Exactly. And many people actually now are looking back to Nixon with this sort of romantic lens, a moderate Republican.
So, Pat Buchanan, help us understand this, because today we think of Republicans in one way. He was a different kind of Republican.
He was indeed. See, he was an Eisenhower-era Republican. The conservative movement to which I belong began really in the late 50s. Nixon was already an international figure then. And so I looked upon him as an eclectic, a pragmatist who had, who was not anti-government. He came out of poverty. I'm sure he didn't think the New Deal was going down the road to socialism. I think all of those things. But, I saw the tapes the other night. Listen to him. And he had these scurrilous comments about Jewish folks when someone did something, and he cut into it. And then you realize I was with him when he ordered the airlift that saved Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and Golda Meir said he was the best friend Israel ever had. So when you said you got to put it together, put it all together, and I think you get a complex picture of someone who was a powerful national figure for 30 years.
Tim Naftali, you've already talked about how you think he changed the constitutional makeup of the country. How did he change this country? I mean, it can be argued that the way we view government itself changed as a result of Richard Nixon.
Well, one thing is that no president tapes anymore. The other thing that's quite different is that up till Richard Nixon, presidents owned their papers. So the actual documentation of the presidency has changed dramatically because of the Nixon era. But I also think that Richard Nixon forced a lot of Americans to think about what they want their president to do. The reason why Richard Nixon, I believe, would not have resigned had it not been for the tapes is that we Americans prefer our presidents to be right. We'll disagree with them. But at a certain point, the president is our bald eagle. We need presidents that are better than average. And Richard Nixon tested that and made a lot of people in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in the press, and in the public think about what should the limits be on any man who occupies, and someday I hope a woman, who occupies the White House. For that, Richard Nixon will be forever remembered.
Luke Nichter, what would you add to that?
I would add to that not just the Nixon presidency, but really it's kind of the long 1960s. It kind of fundamentally reordered the relationship between the government and the governed. I think we've become less idealistic about presidents. I think we launched a field of investigative journalism. Journalists became heroes as a result.
Woodward and Bernstein.
Young people wanted to go to journalism school as a result. I think people have become more cynical of their political leaders. And in some ways that's better. I think it's created a degree of greater transparency. But I think ultimately it changed the country in so many ways.
Did we? But just a minute, I want to turn to Beverly Gage first. Did we permanently become more cynical, Beverly Gage, as a result of Watergate and the Nixon presidency? Do we give him the credit or discredit for that?
I think we did. I mean, I think that, so I would add two things to what's already been said. One is that we also have to look at Watergate not really as ending with the resignation, but having a series of consequences afterwards, particularly for the intelligence community, began to have a whole series of studies of government secrecy, and those really fundamentally changed in the 70s. And the second thing that I would add is that I do think it changed Americans' attitudes toward government and toward their expectations of government. In a funny way, if you had been here in 1974 on this day and said, what's going to happen to the Republican Party, you would have said they're finished, right? They're never coming. But in a funny way, this suspicion of government actually, I think, benefited people like Reagan.
I put Ike and JFK together, and I think that was an era of good feeling in America. And then you had Lyndon Johnson and Nixon. And Johnson was broken by the same cultural, political, moral revolution, civil rights, anti-war, all the rest of it. You know, urban riots, all the things that came out of the 60s that brought down Nixon, brought down Johnson, permanently divided America. Not only that, that division has grown, and the counterculture, I think, is dominant now. But these are the seeds of the wars we're fighting today. You can see the Goldwater-Rockefeller battle inside the Republican Party, and the McGovern-Muskie battle inside the Democratic parties today. Democratic Party is more united. I don't know that the Republican Party can really come back, though, because it has permanently lost, I think, a significant slice of the country.
We are raising subjects that we could go on about, and we'll have other opportunities to come back, but we want to thank you all very much. Tim Naftali, Luke Nichter, Pat Buchanan, Beverly Gage. We thank you.
Thank you.
Before we go to that, I just wanted to ask, they talked about how President Nixon increased the powers of the presidency more than any other president, and it became the imperial presidency. Do we still have that today? Or have we come back to that today? Or is it, has the pendulum swung a couple times? I guess is the question I have.
Well, short statement, I think that Congress has ceded a lot of their Article 2 powers to the executive. And they're just not doing the job. So I think that's an issue.
Right. Well, I think that's certainly true. That is definitely true.
Would you say there's a difference between the Republican Party that they were talking about and the Republican Party now? Is it just the Trump Party?
That's a good question. Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah.
What do people think?
I don't think it's the Trump Party at all, because that's why the middle ground is gaining so much. And I think the Democrats have the same problem. There's so much unease in our country with both parties and what they need. And neither party is willing to define themselves.
I think if you could describe Teddy Roosevelt as a progressive Republican, some people might argue you could consider Richard Nixon a progressive Republican in some ways too, in terms of expansion of the government.
Well, I think as we look back, we realize that 50 years ago we had two parties that had broad coalitions that they intersected in the middle someplace. My own sense is that they've moved apart from one another, and where they intersect is far less today than it was 50 years ago. But that's just my own view.
Also, I think campaign financing has had a dramatic change, established a lot of real fear for those folks who need to be reelected, and right now they have some capacity to get money for their campaigns if they agree with the major fundraiser. And so it's a strange balance.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think the whole weakness of the legal situation, I mean, it's taking forever to get anything decided, and they have brilliantly figured out how to game them.
Mm-hmm.
So what we thought were checks and balances aren't. And it's very frustrating to be an outsider watching all this happen.
Right.
I go back to that quote you gave us at the beginning, and I would change it, that how many times does the same man step in the same shit?
That's a similar but different issue that we all dread. At least speaking for men.
Yeah.
Was that a translation from Greek or Latin?
Yes, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is. Okay, going back to our chronology and what we were hoping to do with the other couple sessions is we're going to go back to what happened in the spring of '72. John Mitchell resigns as Attorney General to chair the committee to re-elect the president.
And this is the committee that Buchanan was asked to head up. He looked at it and said, no way.
Well, those are plumbers.
Well, right, but the plumbers are going to body this, right?
And in March of '72, we already had 3 different aspects of intelligence gathering from the White House and or the committee. One was the Gordon Liddy operation at the committee, which they called the Gemstone Project. Secondly, you had the plumbers in the White House. And third, you had a private detective, a man named Tony Ulasewicz, who'd been hired not in '72, he'd been hired in the spring of 1969 to do a variety of spying episodes, and in fact was sent up to Chappaquiddick. It was the first private investigator to get to Chappaquiddick after Ted Kennedy had driven the car and the woman off the bridge.
Who hired Ulasewicz?
A fellow named Jack Caulfield, excuse me, who reported to John Ehrlichman. So you have those three different intelligence operations going on in the spring of 1972. What could possibly go wrong here?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Joyce.
I'm trying to remember. We all know who Nixon ran against and how he won. 14 million votes, I think he won by. Did he really feel that vulnerable in March before there was a candidate that on the Democratic side to make them do such crazy stuff?
Well, what they felt afraid of, where they were fearful that Ed Muskie would get the Democratic nomination and he would be a formidable opponent in a general election. So they worked hard. Part of what they were doing, and we'll talk about it next week, is to undermine Muskie's campaign and boost McGovern, because they thought McGovern would be a far easier target for them in the general election. And so a lot of this counterintelligence had a purpose. It wasn't just gathering information. It was to undermine the opposing party's primary.
Steve said disinformation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, which we didn't call that. Right. It's absolutely right. Okay, other comments? We're sort of at the end of
Mark
prepared.
and
Yeah.
Mary, may I ask a question about the internal workings of the committee? I'm wondering how you guys discovered and were able to elicit before you put it public the testimony of John Dean and Alexandra Butterfield. Who did that and how was it done? Were there depositions? Did they come in voluntarily for interviews?
Hey, Lance, you jumped ahead because we were going to get there. Right now,
Okay.
Davey, you have to just hold it. It's a good question.
Yeah,
You gotta wait.
actually, I can give you a relatively short answer. When we first convened, we broke the investigation into three parts. One was the break-in and the cover-up. Two were dirty tricks. And three was campaign financing. And each of the assistant chief counsels took one of those subjects. Lenzner took dirty tricks. And so we, at the time, began on dirty tricks. But the cover-up, the break-in and the cover-up exploded so much because of the prosecution and James McCord, as we'll talk about either next week or the week after, that everybody shifted over to the hearings and interviewing witnesses, preparing questions, preparing for the hearings. And that's how we divided it up. And that's how, I mean, I can tell you, for example, we had responsibility for John Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman. And so that's how we first pursued it. We do informal interviews followed by executive sessions, followed by public testimony.
What do you mean by we?
The staff, the Democratic staff would do that.
But
we're going to get to that in more detail, Lance.
It's a fascinating
next
story.
couple of weeks.
Question, once again, kind of building up to this, a book I remember reading probably in the mid-70s was The Palace Guard, which was kind of about Ehrlichman and Haldeman. And the thing I think I took away from that was how much they managed what Nixon heard, right? Which must have had a lot of influence on his paranoia.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they were called the Berlin Wall.
Okay.
And they were the Palace Guard. And it's every president has this challenge, which is picking staff that enables him or her to get the widest range of views and to know what the best arguments are against a policy as well as what the arguments are for it. Haldeman and Ehrlichman were the first folks that actually restricted access, and Nixon liked that because he didn't want too many people knowing what was going on because he feared the leaks to the press.
Okay.
And that paranoia really hurt them a great deal, I think.
But we've also had presidents since who get staff who hear something they say and go out and get it done, and they do not want to know about it. The president doesn't want to know about it.
Right.
And I'm wondering if maybe that sort of started with Nixon knowing too much and being,
Vulnerable. My guess is Lyndon Johnson did the same thing.
I think if I could follow up on that a little, we haven't talked about this either, but I can tell you how this worked in the military. So if you had an admiral, task force commander, and he would say, I wonder if, whatever the topic had to do. And so a Navy 06, Navy captain or commander would go ahead and talk to somebody. It gets back to Mary's good old voice sort of thing. So I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that Dick Nixon probably said, what's with this Ellsberg dirtbag? And Haldeman calls one of his buddies over at the National Security Council, who calls a couple of his other buddies, and next thing you know, they're breaking in. You know, if you kind of fast forward though too, because I want to take this off on a tangent.
With Colson in the White House, I'm not sure it worked that way. I mean, I think Colson was, kind of a Machiavellian figure and with his buddy Hunt, they were able to communicate pretty directly. But certainly what you're suggesting could have happened.
I'm not so, well, I guess what the point I'm making is I'm not so sure Dick Nixon said, I want you to break into Ellison's office.
No, it was to put some tar on Ellsberg and to muddy up his reputation. I mean, it was clearly to do that. Okay, other comments or reactions?
Well, this is off to a really good start.
Oh, good.
I wonder how it's going to end.
Sorry, this was hard to organize without giving away the ending before the. Anyway.
Marion, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking back to that video last month. They were like, we got through this. It was brought in all of these things, did all of this, but some of our institutions got a little stronger, you know, the legislature and the Supreme Court, the courts, and, you know, we dealt with it, and, you know, we're moving on. And it's like an age of innocence when they're having this interview. And then we make this quantum jump to what we have right now. Right?
Yeah, but I think that history keeps repeating itself. And the unrest then, yeah, maybe it was more than it is now, but I mean, step back a couple of years ago and we had people tearing down cities. So I think it just goes on and on. I think we've lost our age of innocence for sure.
One of the things, though, I think the institutions are hugely different. I mean, Doug had talked about sources of information, the concept of misinformation. Congress was a different Congress. We weren't 100% bipartisan, but we had an effort to be bipartisan. There were conversations. We did work with each other's staff.
And we don't anymore.
Well, and so how come? And the suspicion of the press that you saw in Nixon is even tenfold now. Isolating yourself. There are some similarities, and the volume just feels louder. And I guess at the last session, the question will be sort of what next for any of us? We don't know. We're in the middle of.
Well, the question I want to finish with is, you know, did the system work, or were we just lucky?
We don't have to answer that, but we're thinking about it.
Yeah. Think about it.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
hi, Zoomers.
Good question.